Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jack Peterson. I'm NACo's Director of Strategic Relations here at the National Association of Counties. We're very excited for this afternoon's webinar. Thank you all for taking a chunk out of your Friday and the Friday before Thanksgiving, no less, to join us and our partners at EY to have this conversation about maximizing your use of ARPA funding for your county and your community. We've got a great lineup of panelists today. I do want to just do a couple of housekeeping items. First, down at the bottom of your screen, you will see a few buttons. Two of those we ask you to use frequently and liberally. The first is the Q&A chat box, or I guess I should say the Q&A box. That's where you can sort of directly ask our panelists a question. All those on the panelist side of the webinar can respond to that. So go ahead and put your questions in there. And then secondly, you'll see the chat box. Similar functionality, except it also will allow everybody else to see the comments and chats that you are making. So if you have questions or thoughts, please go ahead and put them in those two boxes at the bottom of your screen. With that, I would just like to turn it over to Melissa Glynn, who's with EY. And Melissa, thank you and the EY team, as well as our county presenters today for putting together this program. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jack. And just make sure I'm not on mute, but thank you. And thank you all for joining us this Friday as we head close into the holidays, starting with Thanksgiving. So happy late morning to early afternoon for most everybody who's joined. And we're very excited to bring together voices from 3 different counties who are in different phases of different life cycles with their American recovery process and recovery plan, and well as into execution. So we're really looking forward to hearing from 3 different communities, 3 different leaders, and where their counties stand, as well as what they have learned and what we can pass along thus far as we go through the journey. I'm a principal at EY, focused on working with state and local governments on how to really best use these funds and to maximize, the once in a lifetime opportunity of this funding, as well as so many of the other funds associated with the recovery process to help you make investments, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And certainly from the work that we're doing across the country, we see this continuum of, I think of things from the careful planners to the fast funders, and everything in between of communities who've really at the county and the city level, and now starting to see at the state level as well, who've really moved from funding very quickly and getting funds out and dispersed to all kinds of stakeholders in their communities, to those who are just embarking and starting to think about the recovery plan. So still a great time to share what is being experienced and how those experiences, you can take advantage of and hopefully maximize the impact of the funds, as well as navigate, different funding opportunities with so many different federal funds in front of us. So without further ado, I want to start with our 3 panelists. I'm very lucky to have them, as I mentioned, from very different counties. Dave Tanzias from Madison County, Illinois, Mike Kumazawa from Ventura County, California, and Huey Newsom from Wayne County, Michigan. So I'm going to move over. I'm just going to highlight today's panel, and I'm going to ask them to spend a little time sharing where they are in the process, as well as a little bit about high level about their allocation and their population, just to give them some perspective on each of the counties and where they stand at this current juncture. So Dave, I'm going to turn it to you to start off with.
Okay, well, thanks, Melissa. As she said, I'm from Madison County, Illinois. Madison County is a county about the size of 263,000 people. We're in southwestern Illinois. We would be suburban St. Louis, but we're still in Illinois. Our ARPA dollars will be 51 million total. We received 25 million of those back in May, just around the Memorial Day weekend. And we're, I guess, I don't know if it's unique, I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but we do not qualify for revenue replacement. We actually had a pretty good year last year, oddly enough. So because of that, we are limited as to what we can do. The water, sewer, broadband, tourism, and mitigation. So at this point, we've spent about $300,000 for IT infrastructure. And the reason why we were able to do that is because we also run a small sewer district. And so since their information and data comes through our main, we were able to do some cybersecurity software and get some things started on those lines. The board, we back in June had the board give us some parameters, and so we could kind of stop the flow of everybody's wish list coming to us. And what the board agreed to was that we would first prioritize county-owned infrastructures. Obviously, everything has to be underneath the act, but county-owned infrastructure, either no other funding source or a lacking funding source. So there's never been a match for it, or it's rarely there's ever a match for an infrastructure program. And then if we would get to the point of partnering with local entities, that it had to be one of their priorities. They had to be spending their own monies as well. So at this point, next month, we are going to issue, we're going to begin, the board's going to vote on projects totaling about $19.75 million total. One is a major stormwater project. The other is a major inland flooding project that's been out there for since the mid 1990s. And then we're also going to probably do some things for ventilation, AC, air handlers, things like that for many of our buildings. There's a Sally Port project for our jail we're going to do because we need holding cells, and our current Sally Port doesn't have holding cells as we're testing inmates, so we're going to be doing that as well. That's really about where we're at. So we'll move about 19.75 in next month. So, and the only other things that we're really looking at in the next tranche is the possibilities of doing some broadband. However, with the act having a limited, outlining what we have to have, it almost makes it fiber or nothing. We've had to really back off and really rethink what we were doing. Actually, it was our consultants at Ernst & Young who gave us an idea of this middle mile approach. So we're now exploring that. So that's a general overall where we're at right now in Madison County.
Thank you. And just we're going to have every one of our panelists walk through where they are current status, and then move over and transition to some targeted questions. But I know you all have some questions as well we're starting to collect, so we will spend time on those after we go through some of our focus questions. So looking forward to those. I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa, and thank you, everybody. Very happy to be here, and the rest of some other county leaders across the country. I know this is interesting times for all of us. So, as Melissa mentioned, we're in Ventura County, Southern California. We like to say that we're adjacent to the small country that is LA County, right next to us. We have a population of about 840,000 residents. And our ARPA allocation, the direct funding through the local recovery fund, was about $164 million. So we got half of that, I think, like a lot of counties did in the summer, so $82 million. And, in terms of our plan and approach, I think those can be summarized really high level by three big pillars, which is a measured approach. So we weren't necessarily in a rush to do the spending, and I see a comment from Dora in the chat talking about the challenges of receiving the funds and the rules coming later. We were very cognizant of that. Focusing on one-time projects. We know that this is not an infinite funding stream, and so we want to make sure that we're investing these funds in meaningful projects that will get the most impact and not set the county up for a fiscal cliff, so to speak, in some of the out years. And then I think the third pillar would be to maximize the funds. It's kind of, I think, unprecedented times for everybody in the last 18 months with the CARES Act and the CRF. We just had the infrastructure bill. We've got the Build Better Back plan that that's in the works, and then obviously with ARPA, and then not to mention FEMA too, right? So trying to make sure that we are prioritizing what we eye for funding, where it makes the most sense, and where we can get sort of the most bang for our buck. We don't want to necessarily try and use one funding stream because it's the easiest or the quickest, when it might make the most sense somewhere else, and we could use some of our direct funding on other things that might have a more focused scope. So in terms of what we've spent to date, getting back to that measured approach, we have not spent $1 yet. We did, however, just have our board of supervisors approve our first sort of obligation, I guess you could say, of the local recovery fund. It was $4 million for a wastewater treatment plant in one of our smaller communities in the unincorporated area. That plant and that project was awarded a state grant about almost 10 years ago, and just typical, as I know you all probably have experience with, the grant wasn't quite enough to fund the entire project, and so that augmented funding to kind of bring it home has kind of been out there ever since. And when we look at what ARPA is for in terms of water, sewer, broadband, one-time projects, disadvantaged communities, rather than becoming a question of why should we fund the remainder of this project with ARPA, it really started becoming a question of why shouldn't we? And it was a very easy recommendation, I think, for staff and for our office to make to the board. And then not to mention, I know some of the concerns that we all have in terms of oversight and compliance and reporting. It was going to be a project that's going to be managed by our Public Works Agency, who operates a couple water sewer districts within the county and has a lot of experience, frankly, with state and federal funded projects. So, they know 2 CFR, they know competitive bidding, they know Davis-Bacon and all of the audit requirements and everything in between. So, again, it just kind of became a sense of, why don't we fund this? And then in terms of where we're at, I think we're just now starting to get into a nice cadence with our board. We had a report to them early October. We just went back to them this Tuesday, and then we're planning another report back in the spring. So I think we're going to start seeing ourselves coming to them on a routine basis, staying engaged so that we can get that continual feedback and input, so that we can start taking some of our conceptual planning that we're doing and actually turn into action with actual projects going forward.
Thank you, Mike. It sounds moving along. And finally, I want to hear kind of initial remarks from Huey, who is with the largest county that's on our panel today, and certainly largest allocation to appropriately. Huey, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Melissa. And so obviously Wayne County, Michigan, Southeast Michigan, which is also where we have the city of Detroit. Our population about 1.8 million all in. City of Detroit 640,000. And I think one of the most important things about our allocation and our situation, that we had in our for whatever we consider is going to be the kind of socioeconomic challenges of the city of Detroit and the county as a whole, with the city of Detroit being one of the poorest, unfortunately, in the country. That did come into the formula for our allotment. In fact, if you look at what the county received $340 million. We got our first tranche of $107 million in May, but the city of Detroit, obviously small in population, got $890 million, south of $1 billion. And so obviously everybody, I assume everybody understands how federal grants work. There can't be any overlap. So the city of Detroit's allotment can't be double booked with Wayne County's allotment. So obviously our focus at the county is going to be, none, Wayne County, none Detroit. But there's still some collaboration opportunities. And so the things that we're thinking about, or where we are, let me just be specific, where we are right now in the process, we just went to commission with a framework of how we're going to determine what initiatives we're going to be looking at, right? And so that framework was developed, the framework was developed over a series of months, really, about 3 or 4 months, led by our economic development department. And that focus was more on what are some of the collaborative opportunities we have between business owners, corporations, small businesses, nonprofits focused on equity, focused on economic growth, focusing on making sure that Wayne County is competitive in terms of attracting talent and additional revenue. Additionally, the state of Michigan, a representation from the state of Michigan, we've been working with as well in these I call roundtables, series of roundtables we've been having over a 3 to 4 month time span. One thing that I want to bring out that's super important, and definitely for Wayne County because of our socioeconomic breakdown, equity and the considerations of equitable outcomes from programs that are funded by ARPA is something that obviously the law is very specific in terms of equity reporting, but it's also going to be very important for us because of the challenges that we have in Southeast Michigan, again, being one of the poorest regions in the country, but per capita, but also on top of that, because of the disproportionate hit that we received, that we got from COVID. I don't know if this is a well-known fact, but city of Detroit and Wayne County as a whole was one of the harder hit regions in the country during the COVID crisis. And what was interesting, unfortunately, about that, our infection rates were right at average, but our mortality rates were so much higher, and exposed a problem that any resident of the region will tell you is that we have such disparate impacts from crises because of inequitable access to healthcare, inequitable access to education, to workforce opportunities, et cetera. And so one of the pillars that we have prioritized and we delivered to our commission, we just actually delivered our framework to our commission, to our board, our commission earlier this week. One of the pillars was equity, right? So it wasn't just a matter of making sure that we bring, that we are able to report on the outputs, the programmatic outputs from our ARPA initiatives in terms of equity, but we also wanted to make sure that that was a pillar in its own right, that we wanted to close gaps that we're seeing and make sure these programs are centered on closing those gaps, because we have such wide disparities in our subpopulation. And so, with that being said, the way we're thinking about it, again, from a finance, I still have to wear my finance hat here, but from a finance standpoint, I think similar to a lot of other approaches, we received a total of about $207 million of CARES money, CRF money in all. And we did not know if the world was going to end just like everybody else. So we used some of that money to supplant some of our recurring operating expenses. Public safety was an allowable expense. And so we used that at some level to fund our recurring public safety costs. When ARPA came, we made the specific determination we were not going to do that in our normal operating budget. We felt that the light was at the end. We saw the light at the end of the tunnel for COVID. Time to focus on recovery. So we made the explicit decision that we weren't going to use either ARPA money or SLRF money, to be specific, to fund recurring operating expenses. But we also made the determination even though we were eligible for revenue loss, we also said that we were going to do our best to focus on revenue generating initiatives with the framework I just mentioned before, funding that, focusing on the objective of revenue growth, closing health disparity gaps, closing workforce disparity gaps in our population, within our constituents, instead of funding normal recurring operating expenditures with revenue loss. And so, with that being said, I do want to walk through the specific pillars, the rest of the specific pillars that we presented and created as part of our framework, as our decision-making model, if you will, for specific projects. So health, economic recovery, infrastructure, public spaces, workforce development, and housing. And in our minds, the way we looked at this was, if we can focus on these initiatives, the two things that should come out of this: number one, we'd be able to close those gaps that I talked about before, but also make Wayne County a more livable place, but also, eventually have the bottom line positively impacted, because now Wayne County is able to attract more talent, more business, more economic activity. And so I'll close my opening remarks by saying this one thing. As CFO, we have to, I have to worry about what I call the back office, right? And so one thing that I think that we learned with CRF, and things that I've dealt with even before my time at Wayne County, when it comes to large federal grants, particularly in a crisis, you want to spend some time, and we can get into this in Q&A, we want to spend some time really thinking about how things are going to flow. Are your systems and processes ready to go? For us, we're receiving two roughly $170 million tranches. Our general fund is $540 million total. So this is a nice little increase in volume that's going to hit accounts payable, that's going to hit our central budget, that's going to hit our grants compliance group. And so it really is important. We're going through this process as well, really thinking about our governance, our staffing levels, and how we're going to, manage the influx of additional dollars and additional volume in our administrative processes, and making sure we can handle those. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, we've hit upon a few elements of one of the questions we wanted to pose, which was really thinking about that framework of prioritizing different investment opportunities. And it sounds like, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, that I don't believe Ventura has allocated funds for revenue replacement either. But please correct me if I'm misunderstanding. But Dave certainly said you were, Madison's not replacing revenue. No need to. Couldn't make that calculation work that way, which is great. Huey shared that you could probably make that calculation work, but opted to truly make investments towards the future versus attributing some of those funds back into the general fund. Mike?
Yeah, no, thanks, Melissa. We based off the preliminary calculation for the first year, we actually do have an opportunity for revenue replacement. It's about 28 million, give or take. But I think we're still trying to really come up with a comprehensive plan for the local recovery fund as a whole, and really not try and focus or prioritize that particular calculation and segment of the funding, the direct funding that we got, over anything else. I think in a broad sense, we're again really trying to use it on one-time projects, that measured approach, and things that are going to make the most impact from an economic and social impact to the community.
So that's great. Thank you. Overall, you mentioned the framework that's been presented. Just thinking of folks who have joined the webinar, curious if that your framework or anything that sounds like has been published for Ventura as well Is that publicly available yet? Or do you expect to be over time?
Yeah, I can jump in again, Melissa. Thanks. So yeah, if you if you go to our board meetings, obviously, you know, so that's part of the public record. You can see the presentation there. You know, I know talking about some of the fun stuff that we all had to do. You know, I know entities that are over that 250,000 population threshold. You know, we had to do the initial compliance and performance reporting, and you know, because a lot of that, you know, if you look at what is being required of counties and to report, is reflecting on, you know, if projects are already in flight and we hadn't spent dollars yet, we talked a lot about what we would do and what we plan to do, and so, you know, getting back to some of those pillars and priorities that you know, we have as a county and that our board has laid out, you know, beyond those three pillars I talked about, you know, some of the things that, you know, our board has prioritized is obviously public health and mental health. You know, housing and homelessness is a big issue, I think, everywhere, but obviously, especially in California. You know, infrastructure. So getting back to that water, sewer, broadband drumbeat, and then as well as, you know, economic recovery. You know, one thing that I know that our board and our county is very proud of is that, you know, we, using CARES and the CRF, you know, distributed over 70 million in small business grants, and you know, we worked with a lot of community-based organizations and nonprofits to deliver those funds and administer those funds. And you know, aside from, you know, those funds going out to those small businesses, you know, we learned a lot from those businesses that received the funds, you know, just through the application process. And so, you know, one of the things our board has talked about is, you know, continuing that and leveraging that, you know, maybe not so much in, you know, additional grants or funds using the local recovery fund, but is there a way that we can take, you know, that information that we learned, you know, from engaging with those small businesses over the last 18 months through some of that small business assistance, and help them in other ways, you know, and that gets to, you know, some of the things that Treasury, you know, is really urging local governments to do with engaging with your community, engaging, you know, with the public and getting that input, you know, so we're really trying to make a point to do that.
Thank you. That's great. I know Huey mentioned, especially given the amount of funding available both at the county level and then working with the city, obviously it's quite a lot of funding and potentially could create capacity challenges. I know, Dave, if from a Madison County perspective, as you start to think about programming your funds, have you thought about capacity and potential risk associated with the management of funds? Has that been a focus for you? And what are you thinking that the impact will be in terms of the needs to draw upon county personnel?
Yes, so we have since we received these funds, actually prior to receiving the funds, we had been convening working groups. One we called our working. It was one of our working groups basically deals with projects, how they come together, what we're going to need from the county resource standpoint. The other is the review group, which basically takes a look at all our financial side and how financially we're going to be handling this. It's a developing process. We're fortunate with a lot of our bigger projects, these being already studied and correcting years of inland flooding issue with stormwater. Most of this, once we're past, you know, just letting the bids, letting the engineering, everything like that, a lot of it's going to be taken care of on itself, because most of these contractors can pass the federal muster, and they've done it for us for other things. So we do have a benefit in that regard. We've continually just reviewed. Actually, today we reviewed. We had we were sitting down with our consultants today, kind of discussing and mapping out what, you know, with the auditor's office, what that's going to look like as far as in the reporting standpoint, which departments we can utilize that do similar things that can be out there for us. Obviously, our community development department has a lot of experience in subrecipient, and then also in oversight for some economic development items, because our economic development just happens to be in community development as well. And of course, they can lend us a lot. We have thought of the idea of possibly bringing in a few temporary staff, because obviously Treasury will allow you to spend up to 10% on admin. We're not going to come anywhere close to that, but there was a thought that we possibly may need somebody at some point. But this first round, I think most of it is kind of things that we've done before, so it feels like it'll fit inside. But it is obviously you've added a major county department to your roster, so we think we've got it controlled, but the old saying is you don't know what you don't know. So we'll see what happens, but at this point we're feeling okay.
Great, thank you. And Mike and Huey, any thoughts on, from a managing risk perspective, does that play into thinking about subrecipients and others? Does that play a part in thinking about your framework for not just where you make allocations, but how the potential programs that you allocate funds are actually designed, and the structure that you may put in place? I'll start, Mike, if you have any comments, and then move to Huey.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Melissa. So capacity and that risk is very much top of mind for our county and how we manage these funds. I don't think that we are alone in that. When even back in the spring, when ARPA was signed into law, we immediately started getting requests and solicitations for funding, and it's a real question that you have to ask, as a recipient of these funds, is when you have a nonprofit or a community-based organization, making a compelling case, and maybe that request that they are asking for is in some cases, in multiples of their current annual budget. It's a very real question, to say, do you even have the capacity to manage these funds, and do you understand, what is going to be required of you as a subrecipient? It's the same thing as a recipient of these funds, and the audit requirements and the reporting and all of that and everything that comes with it. And so, without getting into some more detail, very much so, capacity and that risk, operational risk, and then also reputational risk for the county. We don't want to be in a position where obviously we're a light is being shined on a questionable way that that the funds were allocated, and so we're definitely very cognizant of that.
Huey, has risk and the thought of the capacity that you have from Wayne County played a part in how you're thinking about your framework and where you may allocate funds?
This keeps me up at night, actually. It's probably one of our biggest fears. Again, we're talking $340 million just across the county, and this is proportional with key positions within our finance department or management and budget, which would look at these sorts of things. We're looking at 25-30% vacancy rates, right? Because everybody's struggling to hire right now. The county went into COVID with higher than normal vacancies. So we have staffing problems. We are heavily reliant, even pre-COVID, we're heavily reliant on federal grant programs. Anybody that follows federal grants knows that compliance is very complicated, but it's also very interconnected. So if you mess up with a Department of Treasury a managed grant, then that will cascade and impact what you get from Department of Justice, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, et cetera. And so because of our heavy reliance on federal funding, this keeps me up at night quite a bit. One of the reasons why we're not quite there yet, but we are really working on the kind of what I talked about before, that back office governance model, which looks at every single initiative, we're using, Airtable as a tool to help us, to help augment what we currently have in terms of managing projects. So we have a very transparent workflow that says, okay, fine, this from idea generation, funneling all the way down to an approved project, from executive down to our board, to commission, to the point that we've got it put in, got the dollars in the right line item in the budget, all the way through to the point that we pay all the vendors. And so sub-recipient approval is part of that. Recipient approval, procurement, all that's a part of that. And that's what we're working on now, that model, so that we have, Dave talked about, creating a different department. We're looking at, okay, staff auging our department now, but also on top of that, what are the interim tools that we can be using to create that archive, but also track and manage these initiatives? Because it's such a huge risk for us. It's not just the $340 million. Again, our general fund is 540, but it's also the cascading impact to reputational risk, financial risk, because the direct financial risk because of our reliance on federal grants.
The case, and obviously we've had a lot of activity. I live in DC, and the DC activity is pretty strong right now in terms of federal funds. As you mentioned, they are interconnected, and curious what you've thought from perspective, each of you, from standpoint of the interconnectedness of these different funding programs and trying to navigate one, highest and best use, I think was a topic that Meg covered a little bit as well with CRF, FEMA, and other funds that you may have received, but now moving into the new funding opportunities and creating, as you mentioned, a platform that you can manage multiple funding streams, not just ARPA, but will be IIJA, as well as potentially other funds. To have have you been able to really sit down and think about what's the highest and best use as you plan different programs and you plan out the framework you may use for funding? And Bill, start following that up with you with your comments, and then we can hear from others.
Yeah, so for me, right, I think that, I'm glad you mentioned this, because this is very important, and we've gotten better about this. So we have an idea or a need, and then you have the pot of money. So in theory, you create some sort of again, another funnel, which says, okay, fine, let's go from general fund, work our way back to the least restrictive of funds, CRF and ARPA probably being, ARPA is probably the least restrictive of all the pots of money that we're kind of playing with. Disclaimer, we're still kind of digesting the infrastructure bill and our direct impact. But, if you think about it from a standpoint of, least restrictive to most restrictive, and then most amount of money available to least amount of money available in terms of the impact to the county, those are the two axes that we try to look at. Okay, what pot of money are we going to pull from to fund an initiative? Good example, our vaccine program. So, we ended up taking that money from FEMA because we had already, kind of allotted how we were going to use the less restrictive money from CRF. FEMA was more programmatically designed for a vaccine program. The problem was, of course, you got the other axis, which is the ability to comply, right, and reporting and compliance. And FEMA is very restrictive and very exacting when it comes to that. And so, there's a strategy around it. It requires a very deep knowledge of all these funding sources. We did, find a good partner, a consulting firm to help us think it through. But, really understanding things on that, I would say those two axes, difficulty in reporting and compliance, but also at the same time, the restrictiveness of the funding itself and how much is allowed under the funding source. Obviously, your general fund dollars being the least restrictive of all, you can do whatever you want to with them. Those are the dollars. That's the kind of the framework we use to kind of develop our decision-making model in terms of, okay, fine, we're going to use this pot of money to fund this need.
Sounds good. And as a follow-on, I think in talking with Dave, he's mentioned, also trying to look at, can you maximize funding, through thinking about, can you use other funds to support matching and other requirements? And David, you can share a little bit of your experience there as you've kind of started to really look at programming and working with the funding you have.
Sure. I mean, just to kind of add on to, we were talking about maximizing funding. Even this, the dollars we spent for cybersecurity, ultimately that will eventually come over to our general fund, but it's going to be pushed down for 4 more years or so. So we know we're eventually going to shoulder that cost, so we may as well go ahead and bite the bullet. And that's small amounts, 165,000 a year, whatever it is. So it's very small. When it comes to prioritizing, I know that I'll digress and I'll come back. When it came to prioritizing projects, major projects, I don't know if you call us lucky or unlucky, though our western border is the Mississippi River. We get scads of money for that. We can generate local revenue for that. We get federal money, state money, everybody. But inland flooding has been ignored by DC for 30 some odd years. And so for us, we have that as a major issue. So some of our priorities were made for us because there just isn't other funding sources. So we've got almost 20 million there. And to get back to your original question, Melissa, we have also shifted one of those other $10 million inland flooding structure, inland flooding issues to EDA because EDA does because
Steve, I think we might have run into a technical snafu there. Apologies. I wasn't sure at first if that was on my side but it seems like we've left Dave a moment frozen.
I still hear you, Melissa.
Yes. Maybe what we'll do, I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions, but another topic I want to really focus on as well quickly, and something you and Mike both brought up, was thinking about equitable outcomes and understanding, how does that factor in when we think about not just promoting it in terms of the framework, but have you also really started to think about the ways you're going to measure and how do you actually substantiate and provide evidence for equitable outcomes, and how you're putting that into action from a reporting perspective. And Mike, I'm curious if Ventura has been focused on what equity means and how you will actually prove that in terms of how you make funding decisions, and then actually, what are the outcomes-based reporting that you put into place?
Yeah, sure. So, I know that this is, one of those areas too that I'm sure everybody is trying to, wrap their arms around and their heads around, and, how do we even go about doing this? And so, I think for our county specifically, we've been very fortunate, lucky or unlucky, if you want to say, that we've had a lot of major initiatives recently that involve community outreach and equity. So we just updated our general plan. We are just finished the process of redistricting our supervisorial boundaries for the next 10 years. And then we have the census. And, all 3 of those activities involved, an enormous amount of community outreach and engagement. And so I feel like our board and our leadership here at the county, really does, I think, already have a good sense of, what the community priorities are, where our pain points are in terms of equity, and what communities, within the county, we need to focus on. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, as well as a DEI council here at the county, who we are going to, loop in terms of, an advisory role for some of this funding, and helping the county and the board sort of shape that framework going forward. And, we, fortunately too, Treasury has put a lot of information and direct guidance out there in terms of how they define equity, and the fact that it's not just racial or gender, but it's also economic too, and so it's very much a priority for our board and our county, and it's something that is going to be a challenge, but I know that we're well equipped to address it going forward with how we allocate the funds.
Thank you. And I know definitely from as you mentioned, this is seemingly foremost on the Wayne County perspective, really focused on where you highlighted in your framework. Have you touched on the aspect of thinking about measurement and delving into how you will demonstrate evidence around outcomes from an equity impact perspective?
Right, and Mike made a very good point. I almost stole my thunder there. The Treasury guidelines not only provide good instruction, I think, in terms of how we should be reporting on equitable outputs, right? But also a framework for us to continue monitoring equity from our program outputs across the county, not just with ARPA funded or SLURF funded programs. And that's something that we are exploring. It's a great best practice. One additional thing I think I failed to mention, thinking about sustainability, right? And environmental, not just environmental, but environmental justice, not just from an infrastructure standpoint, but also making sure that we have equitable access to the positive impacts from infrastructure investment, such as clean water infrastructure. So we're using the ARPA money, or at least we're proposing to use the ARPA money for a sustainability office. So I think Mike mentioned that there's a dedicated DEI officer for his county. For us, we do not have that. We need one. And one of the things we want to do is fund one with ARPA money. And then once ARPA, assuming we are able to do that, at least start the business of embedding equity and embedding the concept of equity and sustainability throughout all of our county operations, either, and let that live on through ARPA's lifespan, or if county revenues grow to the right amount, then that will be a permanent office. So that's what we're exploring. But the good thing about it, and why I think that this is a great opportunity for us, we know and we feel, and we have to be able to demonstrate equity just based on our constituent base. And I see this as a way for us to formalize, and as a way to improve, formalize, and really inject some best practices in everything we do, and how we monitor things like triple bottom line accounting, how we really impact in the community, not just the dollars we're spending, but how do we make sure that our programs are truly equitable in terms of their output. I look at this as an opportunity for us really to go from good to great in that regard.
Appreciate that, and I appreciate the thought of where you're making investments, and obviously we always caution folks to be thoughtful about not making investments that have this sort of one-time, short-lived, but thinking through how hopefully can raise enough revenue to have go from a temporary office to a permanent function as well. I know we want to make sure, I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. Want to make sure we do have time to address some of the questions that have been raised. I'm a little bit been getting them fed to me a little bit, so I'm unfortunately not able to see them all with sharing my screen, but I know there's quite a few in the chat. And Jack, maybe you can help us out.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa, and thanks to our panelists. There's so much good conversation in the chat, so definitely would recommend you read it all. I also am going to put a link in the chat to NACo's COVID-19 Hub, where we actually have a questions box that goes to our whole government affairs team. So if you don't get a question answered today, or you have a specific use-based question, would certainly encourage you to put a question in there. For our panelists, one of the questions that I think has come up from a couple of folks is, I guess, this tension between approving and spending ARPA funds with the final rule not yet being fully promulgated. And so I'd just be curious, as your planning process has evolved, how you've thought about that. And we've seen plenty of instructions on what types of things might be covered, but how you've navigated that, and how you've planned for it or not planned for it at this point.
Yeah, sure. I can start. So, yeah, I can tell you, especially very early on, that was a big concern for our county. Especially considering, that the legislation was passed, in the spring. The IFR, if I remember correctly, wasn't published until June, and it's still in the process of being tweaked. I'm sure we all know that there was an update to the compliance and reporting guidance last Monday, which is great. So, we're all still in the process of, I think, continue to digest the guidance. And I know Treasury has said, in their guidance that, everything or anything that a county or entity does, while the IFR is in place, that's eligible. And then, kind of when the final rule comes out, anything you do after that, is governed by those rules. I don't know how much, comfort that gives, counties and county leadership. But, it's definitely, fed into, I don't want to say our hesitation, but our cautiousness, I think, would be the right way to move forward. And that we are definitely operating as though the IFR is the rule of the land, knowing that it could well change. And so, that's really, I think, the best thing that, that we've been able to do. With that being said, I think the best way to describe our process is that, and I know it's probably been overwhelming for all counties, in terms of their framework and their processes. And I think if I could, I think the best way to describe how we've tried to approach it is really focus on the what and not so much the how. And what I mean by that is, what are the projects that we want to focus on? What are the program areas that we want to focus on? By narrowing that down, so for example, let's say water, sewer, infrastructure, by identifying that as a priority, then you have to kind of know the what first before you can figure out how you're going to solve it. And by us focusing on water, sewer, broadband, it turned our head to some of these projects that we have internal, like that desalination plant that I talked about at the beginning of the call. So, knowing that the rules and the guidance are still fluid and still subject to change, I in terms of, if I could give advice to anybody on the call, I think that would be my first thing would be, don't get overwhelmed with trying to solve how you're going to do everything all at once today. Our plan to our board is only focusing on the first $82 million. We haven't even begun discussing with them recommendations on how to spend the second tranche. And we're just trying to figure out what we're going to fund first. And then, that'll, I think, guide how we approach funding it later.
I think Mike has a great point. We took a very methodical approach. I shared some of the facets of the framework with you. That we asked ourselves some very simple questions. What do we want to be, right? We knew that this, this is a one-time allotment of money. We wanted to make sure we kind of had a good understanding of where we wanted to go, right? Our vision is to, make sure Wayne County is equitable, where these disparities are at least addressed. Maybe not closed completely, at least addressed, and also make sure that it's a livable city. We're competitive, livable county. We're competitive with some of the more attractive places to live going forward, and we're able to bring in and attract economic activity, and through that, grow our bottom line. That was the vision we put together, and you can't do everything, right? I mean, we've talked about, a smaller component of what we're going to spend is going to be in infrastructure, but that's, it's going to be more around economic development. And so, but we knew we couldn't do everything, but at least we had kind of a North Star to start off with in terms of being able to say, this is what we want to do. What naturally will happen if we're successful, I believe we're just trying to get through the process. I think that what naturally will happen is that as we see success, I assume and know that this is much further down the road, that our general fund dollars will chase some of these projects to continue to fund them, to continue to maintain them, because we're seeing success in terms of some of the things we invest in after ARPA kind of sunsets. So, one thing that I will mention though, and I know we're running short on time, so I'll make this quick, but one thing I will say is that when we started to solicit departments, our internal group, they were part of that ecosystem I was talking about before. So as we were soliciting feedback from department heads, think transformatively, we started really having conversations around metrics and KPIs and what does success look like, how do we track that so that we can hold ourselves accountable to success, and really start looking at ourselves holistically, not just in terms of ARPA spending, but just operational effectiveness as a whole. So,
Melissa, go ahead.
No, I think that's it's great. I will say from some of the counties we've worked with, I know there's some concern with folks about, will final rules come out and change the shape, and obviously the legislative team would probably be best to weigh in, but we do start getting a little bit concerned about timelines and the period of performance that we have for these funds. If you haven't really begun to start thinking about how to plan and spend and how you're going to work through executing the funds, and I think as our panelists have highlighted, there's some ways to fund that are going to be well orchestrated. You know how to get the money out, and you know how to move quickly, and some of them are going to take a lot more planning. There's more sub-recipients, there's more complexity to the programs, but at some point you're going to have to make a move, or unfortunately may not get to spend all you have in your second tranche as well, and want to make sure that everyone takes advantage of this funding opportunity as well.
That's absolutely right, Melissa. Mike and Huey, there've been a lot of other comments in here. I want to give you each about 60 seconds to have any final thoughts, but just to sort of tee you up, one thing that was mentioned multiple times by different folks is using these funds for things like mental health services or childcare services. And so as you each take your 60 seconds here, if there's a specific program or area that you've sort of started to think about or work in those spaces, would love for you to mention it. And if not, we'd love any sort of closing comments that you have. So Huey, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely. So, one thing that we have, we intend to, part of what was within those pillars is a component of mental health and behavioral health services, right? So we're very intentional about our intent to fund behavioral health and mental health services with this money as part of that health pillar I talked about before.
Sure. Thank you, Jack. So it's public health, mental health is a very much a pillar and a priority for our county, and they are very much focus areas for projects that the county is going to look into and recommend for funding. We give you some examples. Our Ventura County Probation Agency operates a family justice center, which I can best describe as sort of a one-stop shop sort of wraparound service area for those individuals that are in need. We have one location in the county, and we're looking to potentially use the local recovery fund to open a second location. The county also has a 55-acre parcel, which has a variety of public, public serving nonprofits and operations out there, including transitional housing, some programs for mental service, and it's an aging facility. It's got aging infrastructure, and so that's an area where it could be funded through a number of ways, either through the water sewer infrastructure or through the mental health, public health, expenditure category. And so, we're very much, looking at that as well as potentially even a crisis stabilization unit in the Eastern County. So yes, it's very much a priority for our county. It's very much a priority for our board, and it's definitely going to be a focus area. I think you will see us do, as we start obligating funds.
Thank you both. Melissa, any final thoughts or comments from the EY side?
No, we're just very pleased to have extend our gratitude to our panelists. I know Dave sent me a note saying he was very sorry they had a glitch go on in their system, and he got kind of knocked off and then couldn't find his way back into resigning back in. So, but we're very appreciative. Know everybody is extremely busy. That we talked about capacity. This obviously affects the folks we have on the phone today, and look forward to trying to follow up and hopefully address more and more of the questions that you've posed. So thank you very much for joining us on this Friday.
Wonderful. Thanks, Melissa, Mike, and Huey, and Dave. Thank you all very much for taking the time. I just put NACo's COVID-19 clearinghouse in the chat again, and we look forward to seeing you all very soon. Please reach out to us or Melissa or our panelists if you have questions. So thanks so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you all very much.
Happy Thanksgiving.